Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Efforts to improve federal hiring and pay often run into the same problem. The system that defines jobs has stayed largely the same, even as the work itself has changed. Here to walk us through the problem and a path to modernization is Gabe Menchaca, a former OPM official and now Senior Policy Analyst at the Niskanen Center. Gabe, welcome to the show. It's great to have you. Thanks for joining me.
So glad to be here.
We talk a lot and look a lot at reform proposals for federal HR, whether that's hiring or pay or performance. And a lot of people have a lot of good ideas that go nowhere. You've got a new paper out that says that's because they're trying to build on a broken foundation. How do you diagnose the core problem?
Yeah. So when you think about hiring, right, you get hired into a job. When you think about performance management, you are measured against a standard for your job. When you think about removing someone from a job, well, there's a job at the bottom of that in the first place. And so I think when you look at the entirety of federal personnel, we haven't gone deep enough to ask the right question, which is, are we even really offering the right jobs in the first place, right? And the way that we structure jobs in the federal government, as folks who've been around town for a long time know, is the general schedule. And at the bottom of that is a really archaic and arcane position classification system that is really the sort of taxonomy and the grammar for how we describe government jobs, construct government jobs, and really figure out what the work of government is in the first place. If we don't get that right, the choice of who to hire or into what job someone might be hired or how to manage them is never going to show the results that we really want as a government.
So the position classification system has been around for a long time. And when folks hear you say, we really need to fix it, some people might go, yay, terrific. And some people are like, no, please don't mess with the classification system, because there are good things about it and bad things about it. Talk about that tension.
Yeah, absolutely. So I should say the GS as it exists right now is actually the fourth system that we've had for classifying federal jobs over the last 250 years. And it's important to know that I don't think Congress, when they designed the GS, ever assumed that it was going to be the terminal state of affairs, right? But they did try to do a few things with it. So one, they tried to design it for absolute internal equity, right? And it does quite a good job, right? Lots of employers struggle with, ensuring pay equity across various demographic or occupational groups within an organization. And the GS does a remarkable job of ensuring that today, right? And so we should acknowledge that, right? That's what Congress designed it to do, and they did a good job. But at the same time, that type of absolute internal equity, while super well suited to the government that we had when the GS was designed in 1949, is really out of sync with the labor market as it exists today, right? Employers of all types in all sectors, both in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, largely moved away from those sort of rigidly internally equal systems over the last several decades. And so the government is left with this sort of model today that really is sort of out of time and out of sync with what modern labor markets look like and what modern workforces really demand.
OPM is starting to look at some of these position classifications and potentially eliminating some of the old ones. When you look at steps like that, are they getting at the underlying problem that you were describing, or are they just kind of putting a Band-Aid on a big wound?
Yeah, I would think of OPM's current work as really the latter. So what they're doing right now is looking at some of the underutilized job classifications that exist today and trying to sort of reel those back in and kind of fold those into broader standards. That's a great exercise. That's something, by the way, OPM always has done and always ought to be doing, both the creation and the deprecation of occupational categories. But at the end of the day, that's not going to solve the problem here, right? Because the entire system is designed to translate an entire economy onto one pay table today. And nothing that OPM is doing in sort of the current environment is going to change that basic fact and the basic tensions that result from that.
Gabe Menchaca is Senior Policy Analyst at the Niskanen Center. All right, Gabe, presidents of both parties have tried to reform this system and have generally been, again, unsuccessful. The paper suggests some pretty clear concepts and structures. How do you start reform without throwing the baby out with the bathwater?
So the most important thing, and, I think in my paper, I really look through this entire history of the topic for the last couple hundred years. And one of the things that I found as I was doing my research is that the most durable systems and the ones that actually get over the finish line in reform are those where Congress really took the lead in design. And so to your original question, right, why haven't presidents of both parties been successful? I would argue that's because Congress really hasn't led the way. And so when we think about the strategy we're pursuing and the things that I'm interested in, it really starts with getting Congress up to speed, getting staff and members ready to have a serious conversation about what the government ought to look like in the future, how to compensate those people, and really what the values that are inherent in the civil service ought to be.
Are you encouraged then with the new workforce caucus that's been created? Is that a place where you would start to build that expertise?
I am encouraged. I think it's really nice to see sort of a renewed focus on the federal workforce on Capitol Hill. At the end of the day, for all the conversations about unitary executive theory or sort of, exotic accountability schemes and all that, the basic fact is that Congress gets to create the jobs and the president gets to fill them. And so I'm really excited about the prospect of Congress reasserting its constitutional role in designing the federal workforce. And so we see that in the Workforce Caucus, but we see it elsewhere too, right? We're going to need a lot more allies that don't just focus on the federal workforce in order to get this over the finish line. And in fact, I'm also super excited to see members from both parties and caucuses like the Build America Caucus really look at personnel and state capacity more broadly as being on the critical path for all of their other reforms, right? So if you think about permitting reform, right, that's not going to get over the finish line without a permitting workforce that's capable of pulling that off.
So the paper offers 6 design principles and 5 core components. I'm not going to ask you to enumerate all 11 of those pieces, but what are the fundamental features of a modernized classification system?
Yeah, so the most important one, and I think this would be the biggest change for most of the federal workforce, is really moving away from a single pay table, right? And today, obviously, we have a single pay table modulated by a whole host of locality areas and special pay authorities and all the rest. But at the end of the day, my proposal hinges on a move from the single pay table GS to pay tables based on occupational families, right? So that would look like a pay table for folks who work in HR, a pay table for folks who work in budget and finance, one for life sciences, right, and all the rest. And that enables us to calibrate to the labor market in a way that the GS just never is going to be able to, right, because it moves up and down as one. And so we can begin to fit the federal government to the way people think about their careers in the first place, right? We are competing as an employer in the budget and finance job market, not in the federal employee job market when we're hiring a budget analyst, right? We are competing in the legal job market when we hire an attorney. And I would argue that the GS's focus on sort of cross-government, internal, absolute pay equity makes it very difficult for us to do that today.
Don't we sort of have that, but in another way? I mean, we have Title 38 for VA employees. We have Title 10 for DOD. We have special cyber hiring authorities. We have a lot of exceptions to the general pay table.
We do. And I would argue that's actually part of the problem, right? So if you talk to members of Congress and their staffs, or you talk to someone at OMB or OPM, and you ask them about whether the federal government and the federal workforce is governable, they would tell you that the federal workforce and the civil service system has largely become so complex, so riddled with those exception cases and special cases that you mentioned, that it's quite hard to actually manage it, right? Someone once likened it to me to sort of a Victorian house that you've inherited. So it's really hard to make changes to because you're not sure whether one cable running from room to room is actually connected to something. And so you're hesitant to cut it, right? And so when Congress is trying to make changes, whether as part of the annual appropriation cycle, an NDAA, or otherwise, it's really challenging for them to actually legislate on the topic because there's so many exceptions that, they can't actually figure out what they need to change.
I do get a sense of urgency from this paper that AI is going to make all of the problems that you've described exponentially more difficult and more critical. Talk to us about how that's going to work.
Yeah. So today we have, if you've ever looked at a federal PD, right, they're largely long descriptions of tasks, right? Do this, engage with X stakeholder, so on and so forth. Those tasks are no longer going to be stable, right? And in fact, having a classification system that is task specialized is going to run into really significant challenges dealing with a white-collar automation technology that actually destabilizes those tasks rapidly and actually means that you're not going to do many of them, right? So rather than focusing on a whole big list of tasks that you have to get through during the day, workers of the future are largely going to be focused on outcomes, right? And so if we have a general schedule where your ability to perform a task is the thing on which you are compensated, when that task goes away, the system isn't going to work anymore. And so I argue in the paper that this is really about moving to an outcome-based classification system where the specific thing you do during the day is create marketing or create a budget or host a radio show or write policy papers, right? And that's much more in sync with where the economy is going and where AI is going to leave us in the future.
Now that the paper's out, do you have a sense that OPM and the executive branch, along with the legislative branch, are picking up any of that sense of urgency? Are you seeing initiatives move forward that might begin the reform process?
Well, I certainly hope so. And I should say we go and talk to everyone under the sun who will listen to us, right? Because I really think that this is something that Democrats, Republicans, career staff, political staff, and all the rest can get behind. And so, I'll be doing a whole lot of appearances on shows just like yours to have that conversation over the coming weeks. And we're really hopeful, right? I think at the end of the day, lots of people have reached out to say, hey, you hit on a lot of things that I've always been bothered by about the system. And I'm really excited by the prospect of finally changing it. So we're optimistic, and more importantly, we're realistic about how to get this done, and we'll be out pounding the pavement to generate that interest.
Gabe Menchaca is Senior Policy Analyst at the Niskanen Center. Gabe, thanks so much for joining me and for walking us through the paper.
Thank you, Terry.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.